Yeah, it's a word I don't like very much, actually, because I think, well, two things. First of all, if we're talking about diverse, you're talking about diverting from something, which implies that there is a norm. And the way in which the word diversity is used in Britain, at the moment at least, is to mean anyone who isn't white, which therefore suggests that white is the normal and that everything else diverts from that norm, and dispute that strongly. I think that we should think much more about, even variety suggests there's a variant from a normal. I think we need to try and find new vocabulary for this. And the other thing that disturbs me about the diversity agenda is it's being employed more and more as a change which isn't a change. So there are diversity quotients within businesses and large organizations like the BBC.
Where lust for a whole life and nothing but less makes people jump out of a comfortable pond into an unknown ocean. Welcome to that journey between the East and the West. Who says Rolling Stones don't gather moss? Hello everyone, I am Meenu Gupta, your host for the day, and I'm delighted to have you join me every week as amazing people share their incredible and inspiring life stories of straddling continents. Thank you.
What roles do cultures, languages, and borders play in our lives? Is there a way in which, in the globalized world of today, we can understand each other and see ourselves in each other? And what about migration? One of the most defining features of the 21st century is migration. Roughly 281 million people worldwide are on the move, representing around 3.6% of the global population. This global mobility is led by many reasons: wars, conflicts, economic hardships, potential opportunities in supposedly promised lands, and in this era of intercultural marriages, also love. The journeys of most migrants from war-torn countries is fraught with danger. Battling hunger and violence, they ride stormy seas and walk through perilous lands. Not that migration was not there earlier, it has always been there. It is the scale and the size of it, along with the reasons, that has made it the overriding feature of the century. And what does migration have to do anyway with today's episode? A lot, but not everything. My guest for today has found a way to marry cultures, thought, expressions, and ways of being across 4 continents with his film and theater productions, while also bringing out relevant issues of our times. Michael Walling founded Border Crossings in 1995. He has directed numerous productions across the world, winning awards and accolades. Michael is also the visiting professor at Rose Bruford College of Theatre and Performance in London. Known for his eloquent advocacy for culture and social justice, he is also very active in the area of cultural policy. Some of his productions have casts who have no common language between them. So let's find out how and why and many more things in his story for what is life but a story at the end. In fact, one of his quotes, which resonates very deeply with me, is, "History and its stories can no longer be owned by one person." A very warm welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you for joining me. And before we dive into the deep end, I will begin a little before the deep end. Who are you beyond the labels of the world?
Beyond the labels of the world, I'm Michael Walling. I mean, I suppose does that, or is a name a label? I don't know. Are we talking Hindu here? Are we talking about stripping away every single layer that society places on you and seeing if there's some sort of core there? You know, there's the very famous bit in Peer Gynt where they talk about life as an onion, and actually, as you peel all the layers away, you find there isn't anything at the center. which I think is quite an Indian idea, isn't it? That's the Maya. So I'm not sure you can find a self that's separate from the layers of the world. I think we construct ourselves through performing, which is why theatre is really, really basic to living. And that all those things we think of as labels, maybe there's a more positive way of thinking about them. Maybe it's the ways in which we make a self. And maybe there is no essence. I don't know that, but I think that's the closest I can get to answering your question.
Interesting. So, more than answering that question, you've thrown up more questions actually. So, do begin at the beginning. What sparked the foundation of border crossings?
Yeah, I'm not sure I particularly believe there should be borders. I think the commonality of humanity is something we should be working towards, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. And in the meantime, we constantly have to negotiate our way across. And I think I became particularly aware of that about 30 years ago when I was working in India. I was lucky enough to be asked by Mahesh Dattani to come to Bangalore, as it was then known, and do Shakespeare's play The Tempest. He'd seen my Romeo and Juliet in America and was really keen to find a similar way in which we could explore some of the themes in Indian society through, I suppose, my eyes as an outsider, and in another way, Shakespeare's eyes as someone who'd never been anywhere near the place. And it was a very, very rich experience for me. It was the first time I'd been outside the Western world. I had worked in the States and so on, but India was a very different experience. And I started finding out things about something I thought I knew, Shakespeare's work, which I would never have found out without the intercultural experience. And to give you just one example, Kalibab, the deformed slave, it says in the caste list, is Kali Bard, the black man. This is Sanskrit. And how on earth did Shakespeare get a name in Sanskrit? Well, he seems to have known the language of the Romany people, Roma, which of course is at root an Indian language. And so there's this strange sense that actually the character is coming home. And from that idea, we started to find all sorts of resonances with caste systems and colonial histories and spirituality and the contemporary neo-colonization, which certainly back in the 90s was going on with the major corporations. And I started to feel, and this is why I was put on the planet, that there are things that we can bring to the world by working together with people who are apparently from very, very different backgrounds. Because that's actually how you find something new. As Salman Rushdie says, mixture is how newness comes into the world. And so really that production was the origin of the company and shaped my thinking for a long time afterwards, well, until now.
Okay, but I got the beginning of the thought. So do tell me the continuation of the thought. So that's how it started. So that's just a spark you've told me. There must have been something more. So that's when you suddenly said, oh, I must put up border crossings.
Yes, yeah, but these things don't happen like, oh, suddenly the whole thing exists. Like a life, a company, it's a narrative, it's a story, it's a work in progress. And it was several years between that moment and establishing the company and it really starting to emerge as an intercultural space where many, many ideas were coming together. And we had thought about that in relation to The Tempest, but then I started having to experiment with what that might actually mean in practice. So, for example, in 2000, 5 years after the company was set up, for the first time, we brought together artists from different parts of the world to work together on creating a piece, which we called Mapamundi, which means a map of the world. And it was supposed to be about the millennium, and it was supposed to be about a medieval world map, which hung in the cathedral in a place called Hereford, where I grew up. And I realized how difficult it was, actually, through doing that, to simply create something from nothing. And I started to realize how important it was to have the germ of ideas ahead, but then to avoid imposing it. So a whole journey around status starts to come in, and you start to realize that this is a political journey as well as being a cultural one. Who is making the decisions? How can they be made communally? How can you devolve power? I suppose, especially as a British person, wanting to do that at the same time as you're wanting Britain to step back from its colonial past and recognize that there needs to be a little more equality in the world. The modelling of this in a small scale in the theatre company is hopefully ramifications in a larger world.
To go back to the point where you said that it was your first visit to India in the early 90s that sparked off a thought. Having said that, what was your impression of India before you went there? So if you close your eyes and think, if I say the word India in your mind, what would have been your first word, your first thought, then and after?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think before I went, like most people of my age and from my country, it was a combination of exotic spirituality and extreme poverty. We used to see a lot on the TV news about Mother Teresa of Calcutta, and there was also the whole hippie movement and the Beatles and the belief that somehow you would go to India and find your soul, both of which fed into the tempest, actually, because of course the poverty is Caliban and the spirituality is Ariel. But there's a lot of other stuff as well, which you only find out by being there. And of course, Bangalore in the 90s was India's Silicon Valley. And so much was happening very quickly, which had nothing to do with either of those pre-existing impressions. So you discover a much more complex society than any outsider dreams of.
The before and after image was afterwards it became more complex. The simplicity of exotic spirituality, poverty gave way to one word, complex.
Yeah, it is complex, isn't it?
It is. It's a mass of contradictions and poverty. And I think many Indians would actually blame it on the British, because from the time when it was once upon a time, centuries ago, the golden bird, where people flocked from over the world, in terms, I think the scientific advancement, etc., was even equal to the spiritual levels. And unfortunate, those times, those people did whatever they did in the British kingdom.
Yeah, well, people don't colonize other countries because they're poor. They colonize them because they're rich. The reason for the British to go to India was because there was wealth and they wanted it. So I think you're absolutely right. A lot of the poverty, which is still there, is our responsibility. And the same is true in Africa and in the Caribbean and so on and so on. And there's not been a reckoning with it. And I think as time goes by, there will be.
Yes, it's been centuries of it across different parts of the globe. I had not thought of asking, but now that we went down this rabbit hole, a question. You being British, how do you, at one point, and how do other people, you think, who are in Britain, deal with what their other generations did with that?
I think until recently, it's just been blithely ignored. And there are still a lot of people who want to ignore it. But just 3-4 years ago, the Black Lives Matter movement did bring a lot of these things to the surface. And there was very famously in Bristol, former slaving port in the west of England, a statue of Edward Colston, who was a slave owner as well as being a philanthropist and a civic figure, was pulled down and thrown unceremoniously into the river. And I think there was a sense that younger generations were very anxious to overturn the wrongs of the past in some way. And there are now things going on where National Trust properties and museums and so on are all trying to give a more nuanced, two-sided view of history and get away from Captain Cook was a wonderful hero who went and found lots of other countries which nobody knew were there, and say, oh, actually, there were people there already. What a surprise. But there's a very long way to go. And certainly whenever anyone mentions the fact that most of the wealth in this country comes from the exploitation of other countries, it's shut out very, very fast. People don't want to know because, of course, it's very, very complex to unpick it. And it's not in the interest of powerful people to unpick it because it's actually they're the ones who are sitting on the money. But it's still there and it's still that dirty money.
Yeah, true. Then the question is, because, for example, the generation right now and the following generation, directly they have nothing to do with what forefathers and so on would have done. However, it might be that these generations feel the burden of the deeds of their forefathers. Is it true?
I think it's true of some people. But, in a way, because it was politicized and institutionalized, that's the level at which it needs to be undone as well. I mean, I don't think we can take individual responsibility, but I do think there is responsibility, which is not the same as guilt. We're not guilty, of course not, for all the reasons you say. It happened long past. But that doesn't mean we're not responsible because we still have the benefits of it in the form of the wealth. And how that wealth is used in the world, I think, becomes the big question. If we simply keep it for our own hedonism and continue to perpetuate injustice and destroy the planet, that's a failure of responsibility. But if it's employed in ways which are more humane, more egalitarian, more progressive, then I think we're acknowledging responsibility, and it has to operate in that kind of way. But it isn't doing at the moment. I mean, all that's happening in European countries, including my own, is we're deliberately shutting out the rest of the world in as many ways as possible. And most obviously, as you said in your introduction, in the case of migrations, but also economically. India is producing so much of what is used in the rest of the world, but the wage levels are minute by comparison with European ones, where we're just speculating around financial futures and doing useless things. The whole history of Europe is one of excluding the other.
One thing that also strikes me, since we went into that rabbit hole before we go to another rabbit hole, is the people are led by leaders. Decisions are taken in closed boardrooms by a certain set of people who are supposedly put in power by people of the land. And decisions are taken in those boardrooms of going to war or those heinous acts which are finally committed. Nobody's asking the whole population of that country, should I do that? No. It's those how many X number of people sitting in that room who will take a decision and then leave it to the rest of the country to follow that decision and its aftermath. So ideally, is the whole country would not be responsible for what was done by that many number of people, either in Britain or in that many countries where even today heinous acts, people are going to war, power play, whatever. There can be X number of reasons. Largely, as my interaction with some peace builders across countries has revealed, power comes to be the most on top of the grid, the reason where everything leads.
Yes, I completely agree with you. I think the problem we have in Western society, certainly in British society, is actually, even though we claim to be the mother of all parliaments and democratic countries, we're not a democratic country. We are a monarchy, and a lot of the power which is exercised by the Prime Minister, minister means servant, so he's the first servant of the king. A lot of that power is actually royal power, and it's the king who appoints the Prime Minister, it's not the people, which is why we quite often change prime ministers without having an election. And so there's no Britain constitution in Britain either. So we are ruled over, and we get to choose some representatives in Parliament, but Parliament does not make the decisions. As you say, it's taken in quite small rooms by the ministers of the Crown. And so the pretense of democracy is very powerful, and it's the big myth. But actually, if you look under the surface, there's a lot that's not democratic at all. And I think you're absolutely right that this is prevalent all over the world, and that really very small groups of people are making decisions. Now, sometimes there's something in that, because we had a referendum in this country recently where the question was asked, do you want to leave the European Union? Oh, yes, we want to leave the European Union. Utter chaos followed. And no one in Parliament had expected it was going to go that way, so no one got ready for doing it. And that form of direct democracy, of course, is disastrous, because the decision is being made for all sorts of reasons which have nothing to do with the decision. But I think there are ways in which we can start working towards more direct forms of democracy, and that's through participation. And just to go back to theatre and border crossings for a moment, we're actually working on a play at the moment which is called Suppliants of Syria, and is about the refugee crisis and Syrians who are stuck in Turkey. And the model for it is a Greek play, ancient Greek play called Suppliants. And actually Suppliants is the very first text we have which mentions the word democracy. And in Athens, in ancient Athens, if you talked about democracy, the one thing you did not mean was elections. In ancient Athens, elections were thought of as part of an aristocracy or an oligarchy. You were choosing rich people who were entitled to rule over you. To them, democracy meant everyone taking part in the decision-making process. Now, of course, that's easier when it's a small city-state than it is when you're a country the size of India. But I think it is telling us something about how we should really think about devolving power, and how we should really think about the possibilities of mass participation. Because when you've seen experiments with people's assemblies, for example, they've done this a lot in America, where people are gathered together to come to a decision about their own neighborhood. Because they meet people who are different from them, border crossings, they start to find out things they didn't know when they were in their own little bubble. And almost always, the people's assemblies make what we would regard as progressive stroke left-wing decisions, because it overcomes prejudice. And so I think what we need to try and work towards through cultural work, theatre, film, podcasts, is meeting the other. Is all the time just trying to get people to listen to viewpoints which they haven't heard before, and just broadening the conversation, and then hopefully empowering that conversation.
Do you consider yourself a global citizen? Because that would be a follow-up of the word that you mentioned, democracy, which is, yes, oft under a cloud.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, we've just been talking about things operating on a very small local scale. But yes, absolutely. Global, I think you have to acknowledge, ever since empire, there is globalization. And what happens in one corner of the world affects another one profoundly. So we have to be, in a way, global citizens. I think the 21st century is actually the era of the local and the global. I think the problem is all the stuff in between, the nation state. Those have had their day. And I think we need to be thinking in terms of much smaller units and in terms of the totality and how those smaller units affect each other.
That's very interesting when you mentioned local and global, because that many years ago, which is a long time back, I'm talking of the early 90s, I remember doing a paper during my management on local going global and vice versa. The global organizations were trying to go local in the sense wherever they were trying to absorb, to mitigate the picture that they had, or to appeal to the masses. So that is very interesting. That has become also, as you rightly said, sort of the hallmark of this century. Now, before we cover many more topics, your wife is from Mauritius.
Yes, she is. Yeah.
And you've literally brought together East and West in your home. What is that like?
The food's brilliant. I've not been married to anybody else, so I'm not sure I have too many points of comparison. I mean, we speak English in the household, and always have done, but I also hear a lot of Mauritian Creole whenever she meets her family, talks to her family on the phone and so on. It's such a difficult question to answer. What's it like?
Let me put color to that question. When I say that you've been brought up in a different way, how we are brought up has a huge impact on how our lives play out, how our thinking processes, and how our actions and even emotions play out. And there's a very different way in different countries of bringing up children as well. Or subconsciously, we all play that out when we are individuals. Somebody coming from the East, and I think she migrated from there and she's coming here. The burden of migration is hers in a big way. So I guess a lot of integration and adjustment would also be done by that person. However, the other person is also constantly integrating at time because it's two worlds coming together. So how do these thought processes and actions that marry each other? That is my question.
Yes, I see. I think if we were both sort of complete polar opposites and completely rooted in our countries of origin, firstly, we probably would never have got married in the first place. And secondly, if we had been stupid enough to do it, it wouldn't have worked. But of course, the reason I was in Mauritius in the first place and met her was that I was directing a production with Mauritian actors. And that was to do with being known as a director who was open to cross-cultural work, cross-cultural conversations, and therefore cross-cultural relationships. So a certain permeability was there already on my side and on hers too. And actually Mauritians in general are fairly used to cross-cultural because, of course, the majority of the population are descendants of indentured labourers who migrated from India and crossed the Kalapani and lost caste. So there was a lot of turning back on root culture, but also a dreaming back towards it. And the official language of Mauritius is English, although the most commonly spoken language is Creole, which is a mixture of many different languages which has evolved into a new language of its own. So I think most Mauritians are actually shapeshifters. The country is quite small and people come in and out of it all the time. there is a great tradition of migration. And Nisha had actually been back to India to go to university. I say back, she hadn't been before, but the land of the root, and had studied at Shantiniketan. So I think we were both already quite used to a sort of chameleon existence. But there's no doubt about it that there are constant negotiations, and which aren't necessarily avert, but it's always going on somewhere under the surface. And you're thinking, oh yes, that's where that thought comes from, and it's different from my instinct. But that's good, because it keeps reminding you that you have this kind of instinct, which is only to do with the way you were brought up and is not an absolute truth. And I think human beings are very good at imagining the way they were brought up is the only way. And it's very, very helpful, actually, to enter a process like that in partnership with somebody who does not think in quite the same way that you do.
In fact, so that means not overtly, but both of you are aware. So it's a level of awareness that both of you have. And that is what you bring to the table to cross borders. You don't have to resort to overt discussions on every action. But that's interesting. That's also a different level of interaction between different people, because there was another person I was speaking from the West, so to say, when I say West, and married to somebody who was originally from Trinidad but born in the West. So they, like many other people, were resorting to overt discussions to understand the undertones. So again, a difference of personality sets. Every set of people have their own way of dealing. So I find that was intrigued, because you come from a background of a different level of thought, from theater, plays, and creativity. So therefore, I was curious, how does it work in that world when you see things, expressions which are not expected, or you don't expect? Now, there are two levels. One doesn't expect, one just lets the whole world be, express in whichever way they can, and they do, and accept it as their way of being. And that's one level. And second level is, oh, it's different from what I expected. So which was yours, the first or the second?
It's a bit of both, but I certainly think as someone who works in performance, I'm very used to that sense of, oh, I'm not getting quite what I expected, therefore I must adjust. And that doesn't have to be made of it. It happens very instinctively, especially when you know someone well, which after 20 years you tend to.
So from your personal life as well as your professional life, sometimes the two are so close that sometimes the defining line is not there. And from this experience of life, then, how would you define diversity? It's a big word, being used and defined in many ways by different people.
Yeah, it's a word I don't like very much, actually, because I think, well, two things. I mean, first of all, if we're talking about diverse, you're talking about diverting from something, which implies that there is a norm. And the way in which the word diversity is used in Britain at the moment, at least, is to mean anyone who isn't white, which therefore suggests that white is the normal and that everything else diverts from that norm, and dispute that strongly. I think that we should think much more about, even variety suggests as a variant from a normal. I think we need to try and find new vocabulary for this. And the other thing that disturbs me about the diversity agenda is it's being employed more and more as a change which isn't a change. So there are diversity quotients within businesses and large organizations like the BBC. So, okay, you've got to demonstrate that you've got a proportionate number of black people and you've got a proportionate number of disabled people. But the fact that the face is black doesn't actually change what the person is doing. And so it's a change which actually makes no difference. Who is reading the news? And we have lots of news readers now whose faces are all sorts of different colours, but the whole business of reading the news is still the same. Nothing is happening which is to do with who those people are or their cultural background or how they were brought up, how they even think. So I think it can be literally skin deep and therefore not actually very helpful with processes of cross-cultural negotiations, moving the conversation forward.
So I get that you are uncomfortable with that word diversity in the way in which it is being used or currently. And I agree with you that in the last several years, probably more in the last 5 years, maximum in the last 5 years, that this diversity word has actually literally scared organizations into action because they have to conform. Now, that is very interesting because that word has scared them. They are trying to conform to the worldview of bringing all kinds of colors on the table, including the brands who would have never done that 5 years ago are trying to do that. Even productions, by the way, I see that more movies are coming out with different faces. Earlier, they would have been more, in the words that you used, white. So there is this tendency to conform in the present moment. So diversity, as you see in, like you said, in Britain right now. But if you were left on your own without looking at what Britain is doing or Tom, Dick, Harry is doing, how would you define that word if you were left without observation of the present times?
Well, I wouldn't, because, like you asked me about what personality is there unless there's social space. Language is part of social space. Language is therefore dictating the way you're thinking, and changing language is a way of changing the way you're thinking. But it only operates in relation to the other. It only operates socially and culturally. So I think you're asking me to think the impossible.
Wonderful. No, that's also very interesting because that's another way of looking at it. So again, there are diverse ways of looking at it. That, because you mentioned language, and you do productions across the world with people from different parts of the world. How did you? There was at one point where there was a cast who had no common language. So how did you guys go about producing that production?
Okay, there are actually several productions which fit into that category, but I think the one you're probably thinking of is the work with China, where we did, well, certainly reorientations, which was made with the Shanghai Dramatic Arts Center and various other organizations, and then a more concentrated piece we did called Consumed, which again was with Shanghai Dramatic Arts Center. Probably that was, in a way, the biggest challenge, but one of the most exciting ones. There were 3 actors in that piece. It's what we call a devised piece, so no one had written it before we started rehearsing. We just made it up together. Myself and one of the actors spoke English. There was another actor who spoke Chinese, and the third actor spoke both. And there were other people in the room who could also speak both, and they were very, very important. But it meant that whenever we started improvising or working on what a scene might be, we were working through what, of course, became the central question of the play, which is how can we communicate with each other given the biggest of gaps. And I actually find it quite hard to describe how we did it. But I think a lot starts to be to do with, and this is going to be hard for people listening to this to stand, because I'm starting to move my hands around as I'm talking to you. And I'm saying that I would emphasize things in particular ways by chopping my hands or shifting that. And of course, you're only seeing a part of my body, and I could do a lot more by waving my arms around and spinning around in the space and jumping up and down. And slowly you just find ways to communicate. And I think what was fascinating about it was that Song Hui, who was the person who only spoke Chinese while we were working on it, she was exactly the same age as me. And there were sort of various commonalities, things where you thought, oh, there's a lot in common between you and me, even though so many things are apparently really different. And I just think we were able to communicate. And it was a sophisticated piece, what eventually emerged. But a lot of it was dealing with the problem of language. I would get 2 actors to improvise a scene when they couldn't speak the same language as each other, and they had to try and make sense to each other. And so, of course, it was completely real, because they weren't acting it. They just had to do it. And then we would all sit around and talk about what had happened, and translators would come into play, and we could negotiate it. And just slowly from that, we started to build the story. And the story actually was about 2 people who couldn't speak the same language, but who somehow fell in love. And then how language, in the shape of the translator, was able to poison that. It's a very interesting play, a very complicated play. And the other element which was in that was the male character, the English character, had an autistic son who he had basically abandoned to go and run his business in China. But the absence of language, complete absence of language from the boy, also contributed to the kind of overall picture of the piece, and to think about it, that actually there are people in the world who are operating without any language at all and experience great frustration as a result of that. But also, I think, sometimes express an emotional purity which those of us who operate constantly through language do not. And so finding what it was possible to do with the body in space without words became really, really interesting for us. And we've carried on doing quite a lot of that ever since. And this was 10 years ago now, that production.
Very interesting, because that brings me back to the very basic element of intention. So that's a base. Then are born thoughts, which can be communicated also non-verbally, and feelings. There are many different ways of expression, which I think in the world that we live in, sophistication sometimes takes away from our uniqueness and our, say, the basic knowledge of what we are trying to do. And that sort of dilutes and at times poisons the final product.
Yes, yeah. There was a very famous director called Peter Brook who just died maybe a couple of years ago, who also worked internationally, and he talked a lot about something he called the pre-verbal, what exists before the word, what is the impulse which takes you towards speaking. And he would work with text, but he would try to get the actors to get back to the thing that exists for the character before the character feels the need to speak, and perhaps gives them the compulsion to speak, so that there's, in his mind, there is something before language, which is, like you're saying, is something instinctive. And I think that's true. And then language becomes a sort of groping towards whatever it is that the pre-verbal is offering you.
Perfect, because I do believe in that, and because the intention and the intention attitude lead to awareness. It will lead to what kind of awareness would you like to bring on the table? And that awareness would also lead to the next thing called thoughts and feelings. And those basic intention and attitude would ride all the way through whatever one is trying to do on the surface. So I call them the basic roots, formations which give rise to the shoots and the fruit of whatever you want to produce. And that intention and attitude, any other can be, it can be a very weak twig you produce also. So I think a lot of work, in my opinion, also in the world of today, we are putting a lot of work, a lot of wealth, and a lot of emphasis on the external product without going back to the roots. What does the root need, and what is the intention? What is the attitude? Even the word sustainability, when we're talking of sustainability and climate change, and when one country talks about, oh, I have done this and this, they forget about another one. Okay, where are they dumping the waste? In which other country? So what is that attitude? Are they not leading to non-sustainable? Is their life sustainable in terms of their ways of being in everyday life? No. So I find that very interesting also when you are producing works of creativity, because you're having to work a lot with thought, creativity, intention, and so on before it is being able to come out on the surface as whatever it comes out. I remember we spoke about it once, about you've done some work with aborigines. Why did you do that, and what was your experience like?
I've done a lot of work, actually, not only with Australian Aboriginal people, but also Indigenous people from elsewhere in the world. And we've spent a lot of time running a festival of Indigenous cultures in London, which is called Origins. And we're making a new piece at the moment with Indigenous people from Latin America. And I find those cultures immensely important for the current moment, for exactly the reasons you've just been talking about, actually, amongst others, and sustainability. It's so crucial that we change the mindset around how we relate to the planet. And cultures like the Indigenous Australians and the Native Americans have always had a different relationship to the planet, one which is based on reciprocity. And the whole way of thinking about other beings that occupy this same natural space, they don't have any sense that they are there to be used by us. They think of themselves as living in an ecosystem in which they are partners with other beings who are not human, and be those animals or plants or seas or rivers or mountains, trees. And I find that really empowering and helpful, and very, very necessary to be said away from their own lands, because on their own lands they're able to manage it in spite of ongoing colonial problems. But the places which colonized them, of which I live in one, haven't even begun to think about it. And the wake-up call is pretty urgent. And it relates to many other things too. It relates to how you relate to other people, and it relates to the same sort of questions of justice that we were talking about earlier. So that I find them very empowering to work with, and I think particularly because the long view is almost always taken. Western people have a habit of not looking more than about 6 inches in front of their face because that's where they carry their mobile phone. Very, very short view. With Aboriginal people, you sense they're always thinking a long way into the future because they're also thinking a long way back. In Native American cultures, they talk about the 7 generations principle, that you have to think about what's going to happen in 7 generations' time before you act now. And you also need to be informed by 7 generations previous in order to make the decision that you're acting upon now, which is a much more profound and ethically sound way of thinking about our actions in the world than the individualistic approach that we have in what's now the globally dominant culture. So this all started by, I'd be interested to do a play with some Aboriginal people because it's about cultural conflict, and yes, that could be good. But it's only by the process, it's only by being in the same room over several months that you really start to find what's of value and needs to be sustained within the conversation that you've opened up. So it always starts from a hunch, but that one I think has been particularly valuable. And I suppose because the cultures are very noticeably different from my own, and the greater the distance, I think the more your mind gets expanded by the encounter.
I found that actually very interesting what you mentioned about their philosophy of life, treating the beings on Earth and the planet, life itself, all the beings on Earth as partners. And you said you found it empowering. And when you said that, I actually would add 2 more words to it. It felt, the very sound of it felt very nurturing and fulfilling, because the other way which currently living life and taking decisions at all levels in terms of organizations and governments is competitive. We are also competing with each other as well as with the beings on the planet, and creating that scarcity by competing with nature itself. The moment you think that way, it is very restrictive. It is taking away life. It is not nurturing. It reduces nutrition also to the self, even to the thought process.
Yes. Absolutely. Quite right.
I found that very interesting. When you were saying it, I could actually literally visualize it. And those are the 2 words which very nurturing and very fulfilling. Just imagine the thought of it when one lives like that. It is a very fulfilling life. They don't need more. That life is complete.
Well, I think it is. Yeah. And ideas of acquiring some sort of status, or no, status is actually included in the natural rhythm too, which is why elders are so important to those communities. It's not that you acquire status by competition, it's that you acquire it by being around long enough to understand how to live, and so people have great respect for their elders and ask questions and consult them and look after them, all of which of course in a competitive society like the ones we live in doesn't operate, and which is why older people tend to become a problem or a burden and get shoved to one side. It just isn't like that, and I find it very salutary and very important to listen to.
I found that actually very beautiful, and it would be wonderful to actually be educated in that way. It would actually be very interesting to have some educational programs run by them if they are willing. And there's something interesting you mentioned also, of course, indigenous cultures. I remember talking to somebody, and I think it was Nusrat Durrani, who had worked, was the head of that program in MTV World. He had started the music, rebel music, if I remember correctly. And I remember he mentioned that it took a lot of convincing till they came on board and started trusting the Native Americans before they became a team.
Well, I can understand that. In fact, I think that issue is getting more of an issue rather than less. And of course, it's because there is such a history of betrayal. And if you look at the treaties across Canada, say, loads and loads of treaties were made between the English crown and native nations, all of which were broken. The constant history is, oh, well, yes, we'll agree to do this with you, but actually we'll have all the money, we'll have all the wealth of the land, we will destroy the land, or you can have this tiny little bit over there. There you are, that's all right, isn't it? And I agree with you completely that it would be wonderful to open the world up for education by Indigenous people, but they're very, very wary of doing it because they constantly have been exploited throughout their histories. And so the culture is guarded with great care. And running a festival of Indigenous people in London has been quite a complex set of negotiations, because we have this idea in the dominant culture, again, that we're allowed to ask anything and that we're entitled to know anything. And Indigenous culture isn't like that. There are certain kinds of knowledge which are secret. There is knowledge which you are offered when it is deemed that you are ready, and which people outside the tribe probably will never be offered. And I think that's also a very good thing for us to encounter, that actually sometimes we have to be humble in the face of the other and just say, okay, I stand back from this. I let you offer to me what you are willing to offer, but I cannot make any demands. And that's also to do with that same idea that you live in a relationship with the rest of the world, but it doesn't mean you are the rest of the world. We're constantly having to negotiate these things. And I think that's very good for us.
It was very interesting. We must work on that. We will come to that. And what was, while we are wrapping up, while working across different countries, beyond the interesting fact that you had castes without common languages, if you had to look back as an aerial view, what are the greatest differences you could think of or feel between the east of the world and the west of the world, so-called east and the so-called the west, when you were working with those different continents and countries in your interactions? And what was the commonality? That would be lovely to know.
I think it's funny because in a way the question invites a sort of generalization, and I'm not sure that there is one. But in terms of specifics, I mean, certainly in China, I'm very, very aware of the enormous power of the state, which has always been there. It's not just the communist state. It was the imperial state and so on. And the way in which that really subdues the perceived value of the individual, so that people think much more in terms of groups and commonalities than they do, and nations, empires, than they think in terms of the self. Which doesn't mean they don't have stars and heroes and so on. Of course they did. But I do remember really quite early on, the first time we worked with China, there was a lot of talk of, if we do this on a company level, as if that was the thing that really mattered, that there would be an arrangement between two organizations and not just between some people. And therefore there's a different way of thinking about what a performer does and is. There's a different way of thinking about what creativity is. And I do wonder sometimes if there isn't a bit of inbuilt hierarchy in what I do. As you probably gathered, I try very hard to avoid it. But I think the people from, say, China or India who work best with our way of working are the ones who are most open to playfulness and individual creativity, which may mean they're actually closer to Western culture than others. And so I've always been aware of that as being something which remains to be crossed. And I remember having a similar conversation actually with a woman called Rachel Mazza, who runs an Indigenous Australian theatre company called Obituary. And she's a brilliant artist and very steeped in Aboriginal culture, in her case, Torres Strait Island. But she said to me once, the really big culture gap is actually not between Britain and white Australia and Aboriginal people like me who live in cities. The big culture gap is between Aboriginal people like me who live in cities and people who live traditionally in the outback somewhere. And she said, we haven't even begun to have that conversation. And that's from an Aboriginal person. So I think the big difference that you're talking about is the one which we don't even know is there yet. Because the people who we get to talk to are the ones who've already gone quite a long way towards the other cultures. And I think there is potentially something really important to be found in those areas where something more ancient and more pure is preserved. But the huge danger is that the moment we go looking for it, we destroy it.
Interesting perspective. That's the reason I asked. Because generally how one looks at it, generally moving beyond specifics, individual differences, is that in the West you would have a more individual perspective, I, me, myself, and the borders would be more closer, while in the traditionally, again, a lot is changing with global mobility. Traditionally, the eastern part of the world would be more community oriented, and we would talk of the we. Even the we comes at home also, we. And we would not think of my comfort, we would think of our comfort. Traditionally, again, which is changing with modern, so-called modern thought and the way the world is impacted. And I had this very interesting conversation with somebody in Ireland the other day, when I mentioned about the I and the we and traditionally this. And then he put another thing in the spanner and said, but actually, the whole world was once upon a time very community oriented. We were supposed to be, and we were. It is the industrialization which began in the West, somewhere he mentioned the US, and that set off a different way of being. The I came in the picture, the products came in the picture, desire came in the picture, and competition came in the picture. So that was another perspective.
Well, I think he's right. I mean, I think it happens round about the Renaissance, actually, when you start to see things like portraits coming into being. No one knows what people who lived in the 12th century looked like. I mean, of course, we've got paintings, but they all look the same. Portraits of individuals start arriving round about the Renaissance. So do mirrors, so do autobiographies, so do diaries. All these things which say there's someone called me. And it happens because people are moving into cities. And in cities, you're defined by a trade, and your trade is different from someone else's. Whereas in rural society, you're all peasants, you're all doing basically the same thing. Whereas in a city, you're a specialist. And so that's where competition starts to come in, as opposed to commonality. And as a result, that's also where to start, in the Renaissance city. And yes, it's been there in ancient Greece and so on, but it's in a different form, because in the theatre of the Renaissance, Shakespeare and so on, you start to get individual characters whose colleges start to matter and who enter into competition with each other and therefore conflict. And that gives you drama. So I think your friend is absolutely right that this is generated out of economic and social change and leads to cultural change. But we're now at a point where the perspective of the world is allowing us to understand this and to see that it doesn't have to be that way. And that's another drama, because that's a conflict between worldviews. And so the theatre I'm interested to create is a space in which we can start to work through some of those questions.
Interesting. And before we wrap up, what is the thought of the day you would like to leave behind?
Oh gosh, the thought of the day. All right, well, let's go back to the diversity question. I'll give you a little aphorism. Diversity is not the same thing as justice. There you go, there's a thought for you.
That's a very nice, interesting one. One has to think a lot on that. And thank you for joining me, and I'm sure we will be doing some interesting work together. And a lot of food for thought has been put on the table today.
Thank you. Well, I've enjoyed helping you put it there.
Thank you for listening to the series Between the East and the West. Do subscribe to the channels mentioned on the site in case, of course, you liked what you heard. I am Meenu Gupta, the host of the series, and I'll be looking forward to your comments. We love feedback. Thank you once again. Namaste and bye-bye.